Okay, we're back in business. Okay, so we were talking about Mies and how much he loves collage and how much that really kind of informed his architecture. So the drawing representational style, trying to carry forward the feeling that we have in this image um, forward through into the architecture, which we'll talk about later. So it was kind of common in modern architecture to use this kind of representation. But it really started to take off and take on more kind of character in life in the late 60s and 70s. There was a radical Italian architecture group called Super Studio that used collage and kind of pop images in a really radical new way to describe a kind of fictional architecture. And this was massive. This was kind of like a big moment in architectural representation history. The images are super evocative and really beautiful, and they rely heavily on photography. So like beautiful existing photography of landscapes, and then the superposition of these more rudimentary kind of hand-drawn elements, describing this kind of almost infinite, like gridded plane, this like monolithic architecture called continuous monument. So this really popped off in the 70s. Super evocative imagery, like very kind of radical, deeply strange. A lot of the images were kind of unusual, much like this one. They used kind of like bizarre imagery from pop culture, contrasted with this empty architecture of a grid. So it's more of a metaphor than a real project, but the idea of collage really kind of took hold at this point in time. It was also really popular with other architectural movements at the time, like Archigram, which is Peter Cook's kind of brainchild. This drawing is a super, again, kind of revolutionary touch point in architectural representational history. So using images from pop culture and starting to mix them in with drawings of the fabric of a city, really just reflecting the way in which cities had become not only sites of architecture, but sites of pop culture, and how things like advertising and all of these different other modes of communication were starting to make their way into the fabric of the city. So pop culture infiltrating architecture, really showing up in through the method of collage and really bright kind of poppy colors in project like Instant City. Archizoom was another kind of, the 70s were a very fertile ground for like very radical kind of architectural thinking and groups who were really responding to the rigidity and the pitfalls of modernism and industrialization that we were really starting to see in the 1950s and onwards. So it's kind of like a disillusionment. It's very like hippie, radical, free love time, which is a super fertile ground for representation. So playing with collage, playing with superimposing kind of more painterly pictorial images with more gridded, typical kind of architectural representation, and exploring the role of the scale figure. A lot of ideas of this kind of like endless grid, this like sea of grid, which I think is a metaphor that holds true today. It's a visual metaphor. It's not a real project. It's not a real proposition. It's more just trying to capture a feeling and evoke the nature of how cities were starting to feel at this point in time. Super interesting stuff. Definitely check it out. So collage is carried forward to the present day. I would say it had a resurgence starting about 10 years ago. It really started, everything in pop culture is a cycle. So trends come and go, they come and go. We're in one right now. I don't know what, I can't tell what it is yet. It's probably AI vibes, but there's always kind of a zeitgeist of like architectural representation for a certain era. And it's kind of a beautiful mirror for like what's going on in society. The types of architectural drawings that we're producing will tell you a lot about the state of affairs in the world. So 2014 collage was kind of popping off. Dogma is a firm that works primarily in collage. They also have a lot of ideas about grids and repetition and this kind of like massive explosion of a gridded kind of city. So definitely check out Dogma's work. They have a lot of really beautiful collages, and they use the nature of collage again to talk about what it's like to try and exist in a city, which is ultimately kind of this like trying to be human in an inherently sometimes inhuman environment. So collage kind of really pops off again after 2008 financial crash. I think it speaks a little bit to the nature of frugality and saving time. Collage is very much a method of trying to save time. Instead of hand drawing something or painting something or making a rendering in a computer, which is very time intensive. Collage is very quick and it's very rough. And the language of collage is tied quite closely to a lot of more like radical political movements and stuff. So there's kind of an inherent baggage with collage that you're talking about both society and then rejecting society at the same time. So it's taking images, like normative images from day-to-day life, and then collaging them and arranging them in new and kind of ideally radical ways. So I think it's a super cool medium. Jack Self, he's an architect. We were lucky enough to have him come and do a lecture here at UBC a couple years ago when I was a student. He's a very interesting man. I would keep your eyes on Jack Self, actually. I think he's onto some really radical, interesting things. He's super interested in the financialization of architecture and architecture as a weapon for kind of capital and finance. So definitely check his stuff out. Very interesting thinker of our time. But he weaponizes collage in almost all of his work. All of his work uses collage really heavily. So using these insane kind of not safe for work images superimposed with highly normative day-to-day activities. So what it means to live in a society where you're confronted with these absurd images of advertisements trying to kind of sell you bodies and objects, and how you just try to live your life day to day around those images. So really interesting stuff. Kind of more grounded and maybe hopefully more useful and practical student work for you guys to take a look at. Scott Archer was a landscape student who graduated in 2021. I didn't grab the title of his thesis. I feel really bad. I should have done my homework. But if you look on Circle, the graduate thesis repository for UBC architecture students, if you just type in Scott Archer, his thesis should come up. And it's just a really beautiful study of, I think he was investigating prairie landscapes through a queer lens and a queer ideology. And so his representational approach through his thesis was to use collage, but he used it in a much more blocky, kind of atypical way. A lot of times collage, you'll see a lot of people kind of cut out and really painstakingly draw outlines around the thing that they're trying to copy and paste. Scott kind of like gave up on the illusion of trying to do that, the illusion of control, and instead just uses really blocky rectangular shapes to superimpose images on top of each other, which is really cool. And I thought was actually kind of a radical rejection of precision. And you still get the same visual effect, but without the possibly like unnecessary labor of having to painstakingly crop out each one of these individual shapes into a cohesive image. So I thought this was really radical and actually very cool. So definitely check out Scott's work. Very, very beautiful. Another student project, not from here, somewhere in London, somewhere cool, Inner Fringe. This image is probably going to pop up on your Pinterest at some point or another. But I think it's just a fabulous example of using collage. So using collage textures in a way that's kind of like fairly obvious. Like this isn't a texture map and Enscape that we're working with. This is 2D textures applied to a 2D image, but still retaining the quality of light that's underneath. I think that's really something you should pay attention to when you're working with collage. A lot of times with collage, especially in like these kinds of dogma images here, the quality of light is a little tougher to retain. You can see there's still some light and shadow going on here, but it's not as foregrounded. So when you're applying textures to a surface, it's very easy to lose the quality of light underneath. So just really pay attention to that when you're working with collage. I'll show you a couple techniques for trying to hang on to light and shadow in a space that you're working with while still applying textures. But I think about this image a lot. It's just, it's a really strong composition using 2D elements to create a very beautiful and evocative feeling of a place. Light and shadow are massive for the atmosphere of a place, and it's kind of our bread and butter at the end of the day. So don't toss it out the window too soon is what I would say. When you're setting up an image, in terms of composition, a lot of people will tell you that there's certain rules you should stick to, certain ideals, certain perfect golden ratios or forms that you can start to manipulate in your images to make perfect renderings. But that's not true. There's no perfect solution, unfortunately, or fortunately, however you look at it. There's some kind of fundamental baselines that can help you start to kind of give you something to hang on to when you're setting up a rendering or a composition or an image. The rule of thirds is basically, it's going to be your BFF in the next couple of years. So if you have any interest in photography, you've probably come across this before. It's basically just like when you take a rectangular image, which is what most of the images you're going to be making are going to be, for better or worse. If you just kind of cut it up into a grid, like a tic-tac-toe grid, by aligning things to those kind of chunks or those thirds, you can start to create a more visually dynamic and interesting image. I'm not sure I understand why. I don't know why our little monkey brains like that, but we do. So definitely play around with that. Wes Anderson movies are kind of like a radical rejection of that. He kind of rejects the rule of thirds very explicitly and opts for everything in the center, everything in the middle all the time, and perfect symmetry. And that's compelling too. So take a look at that for sure. There's other more complicated ways of setting up images. If we kind of look to the history of images that we've produced as a culture, the kinds of images that really resonate with people through time and through space, there are some really interesting kinds of geometries that start to emerge when we start to dissect them. There's a whole bunch of different kind of complicated wormholes you can go into about different ways to set up a composition of an image. But I don't think that's worth your time. I think the best thing that you can possibly do is just take in a lot of images, take in a lot of art that you love, and start to try to pay attention to why you love those specific images, and copy them. Definitely rip off stuff. Anybody who tells you that you should be doing something new is a liar. Nothing is new. You are recycling. Nothing is new. Everything's been done before. You're just recycling and adding maybe 3% more, as Virgil Abloh would say, just changing it 3% more to make it your own. So don't be afraid to explicitly rip off good things. That's how scientists work, and that's how artists work. So learn from the past. My favorite thing to learn from is movies. I love copying kind of like compositions from movies that I love. Andrei Tarkovsky's movies are a very douchey film bro place to come from, but I highly recommend them compositionally. Just like the way he sets up a frame is incredible, and he can tell a story through one image, just by using a really rich kind of contrast from foreground to background. So he's got a little bit of rule of thirds stuff going on here, but just really kind of foregrounding people in the kind of front of the frame, and then backgrounding really rich action in the back of the frame. Super interesting kind of compositional approach. And then also a strong relationship to the ground in all of his frames. Like the ground, the relationship to landscape is always super strong in all of his work. So obsessed with him. He's so good. Charlie Kaufman's Synecdoche, New York, also super interesting, rich movie for compositional framing. If you're an architecture nerd, you should definitely check out this very absurd movie. 10 out of 10 would recommend. But just check out whatever art you're into, anime, movies, games, I don't know. There's art and design absolutely everywhere you look. So just start to dissect the images that kind of make you stop and stare a little bit and start to think about why, and then just copy it. My thesis was super weird. I didn't do a single architectural drawing. I just did a kind of a series of kind of perspectival, weird images. Like not even real perspective. Like this is kind of a bizarre plan, axo elevation situation of a landscape. So I got away without doing a single section or elevation or plan drawing in my thesis. I just did perspectives, and it was fine. Everybody told me it was really good. So you can do that too. Just keep that in mind. These are all like more Illustrator Grasshopper drawings, which we'll get into next semester. So don't look at these. For now, we are going to be covering the basics of Photoshop. This is what we're going to be moving into today. I've got a little screen grab of a rendering from the Barcelona Pavilion, Mr. Mies's masterwork. So if you want to hop over to Canvas, I've got some files you can download if you want to follow along. So under example files, there is a JPEG. So this is the JPEG we're going to use as our base render. It's just like a clay export of this specific view. I've got an Illustrator file with some line work, which I would recommend you download. I've got a photograph from my travels this summer. I got to go see it this summer. It was so exciting. I was like a little It's like meeting a celebrity. It was very cool. And then there's also a 3D model. You don't have to download this. I'm just going to open it up and show you how I set up these images, but we're not going to bother kind of like rendering them out in class. It's a waste of your time. So that's where we're going. Download whatever you want to download if you're so inclined. But this is kind of what we're working towards, just applying textures to a clay rendering to get a collage-y kind of effect. Yeah, I got to go. Lol, I'm bragging. Look at that. So cool. The details were amazing. Like the adherence to grid in this project is insane. And even if you look at like the seams of the material, it lines up with like human eye height. It's crazy. I don't know. It's just like everything is so considered. So definitely check that out if you have the chance. I'm a privileged piece of shit. Yeah. Never say never. Never say never. Anyway, so we're going to use this image and we're going to kind of steal some of the textures from the, I think it's marble, I don't know, rocks, some of this texture, and we're going to apply it to our clay rendering just to show you how you can steal textures and material from one image and apply it to another. That's the clay base we're working with. Yeah, so I also exported some line work from Rhino. This is just a make 2D of that exact kind of viewpoint. I'll show you how I did that in a second. But I would recommend basically like when you're exporting something like this kind of a clay image and you want to apply textures to it, something that you want to keep in mind when you're doing this kind of a workflow is how you can make it easier to select different faces, different surfaces. So you need to start to think about how can I make my job easier inside of Photoshop to kind of trace out or kind of select certain areas of an image at a time. One way of doing that is by exporting line work of that view. So I've got some line work in the Illustrator file on Canvas that we can use. So now we can just use some specific tools in Photoshop to kind of select big chunks or big areas of space that are bounded by this line work, which is much easier to do than trying to do it in this kind of grainy, pixely Photoshop image. So this is one strategy. Another strategy, these are slightly out of order. This is an example I did for work recently. This was a couple weeks ago. So the image on the left is what I exported from Enscape. This is for a social housing project we're working on at the moment. So this is an Enscape screenshot. I was on a super, super tight deadline. I didn't have any time. So Enscape screenshot with no materials applied. And then I was able to do collage over the course of a couple hours to get to the image on the right. So you can start with absolutely nothing and end up with a kind of convincing image in what my opinion is kind of warp speed. I'm fast at Photoshop, so I do Photoshop. Other people are fast at Enscape, so they do Enscape. So you just have to figure out whatever kind of workflow works best for you. This is what I wanted to mention, sorry. So one way of kind of selecting things in Photoshop is by using line work. Another much more effective and highly recommended way of working is by exporting other kind of channels, quote unquote channels. When you are exporting something like a clay materialless image from Enscape. So there's a little checkbox here under the kind of Enscape settings that I would encourage you to kind of revisit and pay attention to. It's a unobtrusive little checkbox. But this little checkbox here will export not only kind of the screenshot that you want to take of your Enscape model, but it'll also export a couple of extra pieces of information. I don't know if Thomas talked about this in class, but I'll just reiterate how important these are. So there's one in particular that's super useful, and it's this material ID. So it's going to spit out a little PNG for you. And what that's going to have is this kind of absurd looking rainbow color version of your rendered image. So you'll get this PNG, and then you'll also get this kind of crazy rainbow view. And each color here represents a different, actually, this is the wrong image, but if this was a material ID image, each color would represent a different material that you've applied to that object. So just another way of making it super, super easy when you're in Photoshop to select a specific face or a specific material that you're trying to replace with a texture. So material ID is really useful if you do have materials applied in your model. If you've already kind of taken the time to apply different materials to different surfaces, material ID is super useful. This is actually not a material ID image. This is an object ID material image. So every unique object in this view has a unique color. which is why it looks so insane. I didn't have the time to apply any materials here, so each object gets its own color. And that's still kind of helpful because you can still select individual objects at a time, which makes it much easier than trying to like trace them out with a little lasso. So just keep that in mind. Come back to this slide to try to remember to turn this stuff on. It's important. So we've been kind of revisiting our rendering strategy at the office. Our renderings have historically looked like shit, and we're trying to change that. So, but it's a tricky thing to do when you're working with an office of like 15 people and everybody needs to render sometimes. Trying to come up with a cohesive style is really difficult. So we've been trying to set some ground rules and stuff for that. But everybody has different strengths and weaknesses. Everybody has different strategies. Me, I'm on the far left wing, 90% Photoshop, only 10% kind of Enscape material clay rendering situation. That's how I'm fastest and that's what I prefer. Other people in the office like Henry, Henry's a little digital wizard, and so he prefers everything to be in Enscape. So he takes the time that I take making an image, and he takes the time applying materials. The benefit of this is that once Henry has applied these materials, his model is kind of good to go, and he can keep zooming around that model and cranking out as many views as he needs. So this is a really flexible and great workflow. If you're good at digital stuff, I highly encourage you stick to this. Just because there is a certain flexibility in producing multiple images and multiple views really quickly. Once you've put in the labor of putting the materials into the model, that model exists from all angles for you, which is great. Whereas I put in a couple hours to this one image, if my boss tells me he doesn't like the angle of this view, which he does all the time, that bastard, then I'm completely screwed. Like I'm totally out of luck. I have to spend another 6 hours on this. So just keep that in mind. It totally depends on who you are as a person. If you're working in Photoshop, just make sure that the composition you're starting with is really strong and that you've talked to other people about it and that it makes sense and it looks good. Yeah, anyways, you can see Jess did kind of a 50-50 version. So she is good at everything, that rat bastard. So she did kind of a lot of material work in Enscape and then a lot of touch up in Photoshop. So it was like the perfect balance. Our office does exist on a spectrum, and it is me and Henry at the extremes and Jess perfectly in the middle. So anyway, it's an interesting study in different strategies producing slightly different visual results. It's just the nature of the material you're working with. There's always going to be a kind of thumbprint of whatever software you've used in the images you're producing. Ideally, we're trying to commit to the style for the office, which is like a big, scary undertaking. Historically, our renderings have been horrific, like horrifically bad. So we're panicking a little bit. We're going through a whole restructuring. We've gone through some traumatic events this past year, and we're trying to come out more beautiful and cohesive out the other side. But it's been an interesting exercise trying to set up rules for like having a cohesive vision across a project and across an office. So this project has been a bit of a test case. This is an image produced by one of our recent interns, Julieta, who graduated recently. I don't know if any of you knew her. Obsessed with her. She's so funny. So she kind of saw all three of our workflows and picked her own stance. I think she's slightly towards my end of the spectrum, maybe where Jess is, somewhere in the middle. And this is the image she produced, kind of flying blind without any kind of advice from us. So interesting results, combining the different strategies of three people into a fourth. So kind of a fun, interesting study. I think this is mostly collage. Okay, so one other thing I wanted to touch on, I'm going a little slower than I hoped, sorry. I just wanted to mention one little kind of sneaky thing in Rhino that is really great to install if you're interested in Rhino Render. I'll pull up Rhino and I'll show you how to install this in 1 second. But there's this little post effect thing you can download for Rhino, and it's called the AMD denoiser. So this will take your image from this kind of like grainy, shitty first pass, which I got because I only spent 3 minutes rendering it. It only did 25 samples or 25 passes, which you can see in the bottom left here. But once you check this little denoiser box, it kind of smooths out your image for you without doing any extra work or any extra time. It only takes like 2 seconds to do this kind of processing where it just smooths out all of those like super bumpy pixels and takes it from this kind of grainy view to this smoother view. So that's a nice option if you're super short on time and you're feeling really stressed. This can kind of make your images look more complete. Although there's something to be said for a grainy vibe. I kind of like that. It's kind of a vibe. So I'll show you how to install this little AMD denoiser thing in Rhino first, and then we'll hop into Photoshop. Okay, I'm going to open up Rhino. Any questions, concerns? Independently of what's behind them? Oh, well, there is what's called an alpha channel. So this is what Enscape lets you export. Object ID, material ID, we talked about that. Depth channel isn't super helpful. It's just kind of like atmospheric perspective. Alpha channel is not going to give you light and shadow either, but it will give you kind of like a black and white image of what you're producing, and sometimes that will have the shadow outline cast in it. So take a look at the alpha channel one. I don't fully understand what that is, but in short, not specifically, but sometimes you can check this one and it might be there. Good question. Any other questions? Cool. I'm going to open up my 3D model. I downloaded this from the SketchUp warehouse, so lol, sorry if it's weird. A very rich resource, don't discount it. You can open up SketchUp files in Rhino super easily, so it's great. So this is the Make 2D I made of my little perspective. If I zoom around, you can see I've got my nice SketchUp warehouse 3D model of the Barcelona pavilion. Ain't she cute? I was there. Oh, so exciting. And some psycho even took the time to model this crazy bitch. So anyway, check that out. It's pretty sick. Anyways, the view I ended up setting up is over in my saved views over here. Got my little camera panel. I set up this one. I thought it looked good. To each his own. So to get that Make 2D outline, I just selected everything. So Control or Command A, and then Make 2D. The only thing I changed that was slightly different was this viewport rectangle. So I turned on viewport rectangle, and that just kind of crops it to specifically this view that I have in my Rhino window here. I'm not going to run it because it'll take too long, but that's what I did. I also just did a clay Rhino render. So I just hit the little render button. In terms of rendering settings for what I had going on, I really didn't do anything. I think there's just a 360 environment of a like default Rhino Studio. So I used the default Rhino Studio lighting settings under the rendering panel here. Didn't change a damn thing. I just changed the intensity slightly of the skylight. So the sun is on, the skylight is on, and I just changed it down from 1 to 0.8 because 1 was like super bright for some reason. And oops, sorry, that was it. So I hit go on my image. I set it to draft. Oh, maybe I changed it to good quality. Look at me. Okay. Good quality is what I exported it to, but I limited it to 25 passes somewhere. Samples in here. I set it to 25 samples. Anyway, so I'll show you how to install that little AMD denoiser thing while we're in here. By default, if I bring up my little rendering window, let me set it to shitty quality first. Where is it? I forget. Okay. So if I go to hit render, by default, this won't show up for you. It's not installed. It's something from this new kind of like internet web of rich resources that they're trying to work into Rhino. Is kind of like a plugin. It's basically a plugin for Rhino that you just have to turn on essentially. So by default, this won't show up for you. We just want to make sure that this little checkbox is here for us when we want it. Okay, and the way that we do that is somewhere in here. I think it's under tools. So we're going to go under tools. This should be the same on PC. I'm on a Mac right now, but it should be identical on PC. And there's an option here called Package Manager. This is that kind of like upload to the internet connection. And it should bring up this little floating window for you. There's a billion little plugins that a bunch of nerds around the world have made for us. I haven't explored many of them at all, but I'm sure there's some like crazy, super rich stuff in here. So worth a look. We'll touch on a lot of this stuff next semester when we get into Grasshopper. But for now, we're going to skip over it. And I'm just going to type into the search bar AMD denoiser. This is the one. So you should just have to hit install and it'll install it automatically for you. Okay, so that's just a little aside, something to pay attention to. Moving forward, let's say that I've taken my little perspective, it's all good to go, and I've exported a cute little rendering from Rhino Render, no materials applied whatsoever. I'm gonna get out of Rhino and hop into Photoshop. Any questions? All good? Okay, welcome to Photoshop, Sarah. This is what Photoshop looks like when you open it. It's exactly the same interface as Illustrator, so I'm not going to dwell on it too much. You can, much like Illustrator, open a new file either by clicking New File button in the top left-hand corner, or just by clicking and dragging an image onto this interface. That's what I'm going to do because I don't want to take the time to like set up the proper resolution and width and height of my image. I don't care right now. So I'm just going to kind of click and drag my little rendered output onto this interface here. So I've got my little JPEG kicking around. I can just drag and drop that right into Photoshop. And it'll open up a new document for me. That document will be set to whatever image settings that specific rendering has. And you can double check that by looking down in the bottom left-hand corner here. It's maybe too small to see on my screen, but when you look at yours, it should tell you how many, kind of the dimensions of that image, and then the resolution in brackets. So this image right now is 2000 pixels by 1000 pixels, which is what I set it up to be in Rhino. And then the resolution is 150 pixels per image, or 150 DPI. So 150 is usually, if you remember from like one of our first lectures, 150 DPI is usually fine for screen use. If you're printing something, and honestly, anytime you're doing a rendering, I highly, highly recommend a resolution of 300 DPI. That's going to give you a lot more flexibility and control to print it big style. So use 300 DPI if you can. It'll just take a little longer to render. Okay, welcome to Photoshop. So this is what she should look like. If yours looks different, you can come up to Window, Workspace, and then just make sure you're working with Essentials Layout. That's what I'm using. Basic. So I think we kind of went over this a long time ago already, so this shouldn't be news. But much like Illustrator, super similar layout. God bless Adobe. All of our tools are on the left-hand side here. We've got all of our layers on the right-hand side down at the bottom here. This is the most important part. So we want to keep an eye on our layers here. And then some properties and some color swatches and stuff. We're just going to ignore this top stuff for now. All we really care about is layers at this moment. So when you open an image in Photoshop, you can see by default, it's brought it in as a background layer. And you can see that there's a little lock icon on that layer. So if I try to do anything, if I try and draw a mustache on this beautiful lady, oh, it is going to let me do it actually. Whoops, sorry. Take that back. But if I try and move this around, it's locked. It'll give you this like error warning. This is a background layer. Do you want to convert it to a normal layer? So I'm going to hit yes. Yeah, convert to a normal layer. Do it. And now I can move it around. No problem. Resize it however I want. That's actually not something I'm going to do. So I'm actually going to relock it. I just did that for show. Sorry. And you can do that by pressing the little lock icon on the top of your layer stack over here on the right-hand side. So I'll press lock, and now I can't touch it anymore. Great. Okay, so I'm also going to bring in my line work. Right now, you can see everything's kind of pixely. So if I want to start selecting stuff in Photoshop, it's kind of annoying. There's a couple different ways to select things in Photoshop, a couple of different like tools to do so. So starting from the top left-hand corner here, from my tools list, we've got the rectangular selection here. So this little dashed rectangle, this is your bread and butter. This lets you select things by rectangle. Great. Revolutionary, love it. If you right click on that, there's a couple different other shapes you can use to select. So if you want to select a perfect circle, there's other shape options in there. Look at that. Wow. Radical. If you want to cut out a very specific niche shape, the tool below that is what you're going to want to use. So this is the polygonal lasso tool. So this lets you, kind of much like the pen tool in Illustrator, it lets you click and drag a series of lines. At the end of the day, you do have to make a closed loop. So you have to go back to where you started from. And once you're at the point where you started from, again, you'll see that little kind of like circle shape show up over your cursor. There's like a little dot that appears. And that's how you know when you've kind of closed the loop. So I'll click to close that loop. And now it's kind of giving me this like animated dashed line. That's great. So that's one way to select. If you ever want to unselect something, because Photoshop's kind of annoying, like if I go back into and try to move things around, it's only dealing with that selection. If you ever want to like deselect, there's a nice handy button right here that says deselect, or you can also press Control or Command D, and then your selection is gone. Photoshop is lovely in that you can undo and redo selections. So if you've taken 20 minutes and trimmed out the little Nike logo on somebody's sneakers or something, and then you make a mistake and you deselect it. Oops, sorry. You can just press Control Z and that selection will come back. That said, if you're partway through a selection, like let's say I was tracing out this lovely figure here and I get to a sensitive place and somebody asks me a question and I hit escape by mistake, I can't go back and like reselect that. It's gone. You have to like close the loop before it will remember that as a selection kind of worth remembering. So just keep that in mind. Don't get too precise with your clicking because you can lose it all in a second, let me tell you. So that's the polygonal lasso tool. If you right click on that, there's an option for kind of a more freeform one. Just the regular lasso tool. And this one's just like click and drag wavy shape style. So that's an option for you as well. I never use this. Makes me crazy. The one below that, this is where things start getting good. So this little magic wand icon, this is the magic wand tool, I think, in Photoshop. And this uses Photoshop's inherent logics to select things that it thinks are the same thing. So it looks at pixels and it looks at pixels next to it and it tries to guess what belongs to the same shapes. It's not going to let me click on my locked layer because it doesn't do that. So if I unlock my background layer here and select it, you have to select the actual layer you want to work with. Otherwise, it doesn't know what you care about. I can click on things and you'll see just by one click, it's now selected everything it thinks is the same thing. I can try and select just that little piece or the bright spot here. You can see it's trying its best, but the pixels only give it so much information. It's like only so useful. It's just trying to click and select things it thinks are the same thing. So this is a super useful tool. I use it all the time. It also has a weird cousin that I use probably more frequently. So if you right click on this option here, there is another one called Quick Selection Tool. So this one uses a slightly different processing algorithm to the magic wand. And it tries to have like a slightly higher order level of thinking. So when we select things with the magic wand, you can see it's a little bit more precise. So it's a little more choosy and it's trying to make something coherent and geometric out of what you're selecting. So I use this one the most. I use this all the time. So I highly recommend right clicking and using the quick selection tool. That one is the bomb. Much like anything, hold down Shift to keep adding and hold down Alt or Option on a Mac to deselect. So you can kind of move forwards or backwards by holding down Alt to delete or Shift to add. And you can change how big of a deal your wand is, like how large it's searching for. So you can play with the size up at the top here. That's an option for you as well. There's also a new, I don't know if it's new. There's also an object selection tool here. I haven't used this one quite as much, but it is getting smarter. They have implemented a ton of AI shit into Photoshop this year. And it started out kind of goofy and embarrassing, but it is getting like scary, scary good by the day. So it gets better and better every day the more people use it. So keep your eyes fixed on the AI properties of Photoshop because they're kind of insane and they're getting better and better and better. The object selection tool is one thing that uses AI in Photoshop and it's getting really good. You can see when I click on that and hover over my beautiful figure here, it's pretty damn smart about where the person is in this image. It doesn't really pick up much else. Like it's kind of like, maybe that's your floor. I don't know what you're doing. What is that? But it can find the human pretty quickly, which is freaky a little bit. So we'll talk about that next semester. We'll talk about my anxieties a little more later on, but that's a very cool tool as well. I'll also talk about this little select subject option here down at the bottom. This is a kind of new thing in Photoshop. This little bar is probably going to be floating around somewhere for you. Select subject is an interesting tool, maybe not so much for this image, but for if you have like a portrait of someone or a picture of someone, you're trying to cut out their likeness to use as a scale figure in your drawings. Select subject can be interesting. It basically just like scans your image and tries to find what it thinks is the person or the thing in your image. So that's another option for selecting stuff. Photoshop is all about selection. It's all about kind of cutting out and cropping. It's essentially, if you were doing a manual collage, selecting stuff is the scissors that you're using to kind of trim out shapes. So very important skill. To make that easier for myself, I'm going to bring in the line work from Illustrator that I have. Just kicking in a file somewhere. I hope I didn't delete it. There it is. So this is the Illustrator file that's up on Canvas. I'm just going to drag and drop it into Photoshop. So Photoshop will pop up with this little dialog here, open as smart objects. We'll talk about what a smart object is in 1 second. So I'll hit OK. I don't want to mess around with this too much. And you can see it's brought in my line work. It's still kind of like pixely because it hasn't decided where to put it yet. So I can click and drag this around to place it somewhere, but it actually brought it in pretty damn good. When you're happy with the placement, you do have to tell it that it's okay. You do have to click the little check mark up here. Otherwise, it won't let you do other things. So I'm going to click the check mark for yes, I'm happy with that. And then the line work gets a little bit crisper. So I'll just kind of click and drag it until, oops, until it looks like it's in the right spot. Looks good. So now I've got a little bit of line work to work with here. I think it cropped it to my artboard in Illustrator. So this is an example of importing the Illustrator file slightly incorrectly. You can see it didn't import all of the line work that I was interested in because in the Illustrator file itself, there's an artboard in there that's slightly smaller than the line work. I had some line work that was like spilling over the edge. So if I try and import that one more time, I'll drag and drop it in. This time, instead of selecting the page, or a crop to bounding box, we're going to crop to a media box. So media box should just look for all of the media in the file, hopefully. I'll be embarrassed if this doesn't work, but I'm not super sure. And I'll hit OK. That didn't do it. Okay, I was wrong. Anyway, just play around with those options. There's a way to do it. For now, to get over my personal embarrassment, I'm just going to crop the Photoshop or my overall clay render to match where the line work runs out. So cropping in Photoshop is super easy. There is a crop tool just below our lovely little magic wand tool. So you can click this little crop icon here and it'll bring up the cropping tool for you. If you find that it's locked to a specific ratio that you're not stoked about, like if you don't want to be cropping to a square, just come up to these little settings in the top left-hand corner here. There's a whole bunch of presets you can work with, and you can make your own custom presets, which I have a few of. But just change it to ratio if you want, or hit clear. So to get rid of this, the thing that it's like locking it to a square, I'm just going to press clear. And then I can click and drag these corners to be whatever I want them to be. Cool, so I'm cropping it to fix my mistakes. One thing that's important to keep in mind, I think we touched on this earlier, this little delete cropped pixels button here. Hopefully it's not checked for you. If it's not checked, you can see what happens when I click yes and crop all my stuff. The things outside of what I've just cropped it to still exist. So that image is still back there. All of that information, all those pixels are still kicking it outside of my little image artboard here. However, if you do click delete cropped pixels up at the top here, when you go to crop your image, it's gonna do exactly as it says and delete everything that's outside of the bounds of what you're cropping to. So if I check yes on delete cropped pixels, now I've got an image where it's gotten rid of everything that's outside of the bounds of this little box. So usually I think it's good practice to kind of keep stuff where possible, just in case you want to make changes. However, if your file is mega, mega, mega huge and you have maybe like a picture of the sky or something in the background that's taking up a whole bunch of gigabytes, just do a little quick crop and delete the cropped pixels to get rid of stuff that's like outside of the purview of your image. It'll help you get a smaller Photoshop file size. If your Photoshop file size gets over 2 gigabytes, which sounds difficult, but you will get there, I promise. It won't let you save it anymore. It like doesn't, your computer doesn't have enough memory to save the file. So you do have to keep your Photoshop file relatively small. Something that contributes to the size of your Photoshop file is the use of smart objects. So if you see over on the right-hand side, if you'll remember when I brought in my line work slightly incorrectly, it was bringing it in as a smart object. So a smart object in Photoshop, you'll know it's one of those when you see this little like page icon over the thumbnail in your layers panel here, this little like gray square. If you hover over it, it'll say like smart object. It'll say, I'm so smart. And then that's how you know. So a smart object is different from a regular layer in Photoshop. It has a little bit more memory and a little bit more life to it, and it's easier to resize. So basically it just means that Photoshop is going to pay more attention to this layer and retain more information about it. So a beauty of using a smart object is that you can resize it and it won't kind of lose information. So if I make this really, really small, this is my line work layer. If I make it super tiny, and so it adjusts to the pixels of my image, it looks like shit when we zoom in. That's no good. With a normal layer, when you resize it, it will have kind of lost all of the fidelity of our earlier of our earlier iteration. So when we scale it back up, it'll look just like this. It'll look super shitty. But since this is a smart object, when I go to scale it back up, it remembers what it was before. So it's able to kind of retain and bring back that information, which is great. So smart objects, it kind of remembers pixels for you. There are also objects that you can change independently. So if I maybe want to mess around with this line work separately from this Photoshop file, if you double click on the little smart object icon, it will open up and allow you to edit that layer on its own. So since this is an Illustrator object, it's opening up Illustrator for me now, and it's going to let me edit and change aspects of this file inside of Illustrator, which is great. So I can make changes in a vector format in Illustrator and then save them, and they'll percolate back into Photoshop for me, which is great. I don't know if we have enough time to do that since my Illustrator is so slow to load. I'll hit OK. So this one, I think it's opening the source file, and you can double check by checking the file name up at the top here. So I remember what I called that file, and I know that that's what this file is called. So I'm confident that it's opening up the original. When you're dragging and dropping something into Photoshop like that, it's linking it to the file itself. And that's another beauty of smart objects is it's linking in a file from elsewhere. So you can modify the existing file and make changes in that file, and then they'll percolate back into your Photoshop once you've made changes. So if you have stuff you're doing in Illustrator, you can make a whole bunch of changes in Illustrator, hit save, and then it'll update it automatically in Photoshop if you've dragged and dropped it in as a smart object. Otherwise, if you're in Photoshop and you have just kind of a regular layer, so I'll make a copy of this one, and if I'll right click on it and rasterize the layer. So if you ever have a smart object and it's pissing you off and you want to save file size a little bit, or maybe you want to do something like erase something or paint on top of it. Oops. It's not going to let me do that on top of my smart object layer because it wants to retain all of those pixels. It wants to remember all of that stuff. So it's not going to let you erase things. It's not going to let you erase information. It'll give you this little error window that'll pop up that'll say, you can't do that to a smart object layer. How dare you try to delete these pixels? And it'll force you to rasterize the object. So rasterizing means it is ditching all of the vector data it has on that layer. It's getting rid of all of its knowledge about those pixels, and it's flattening it down to exactly the pixels that you have on the screen at that moment. So when I hit OK, rasterize the smart object, you can see that little icon, that smart object icon has completely disappeared. And now we just have a regular layer. Oops. So if I resize this one, if I make it super tiny and hit OK, when I go to scale it back up, now you can see it looks like shit. However, we are able to do kind of destructive operations to it. So I can use tools like the eraser tool and I can erase chunks of it, no problem. Whereas it won't let me do that with a with a smart object layer. Does that kind of make sense? The difference between a regular rasterized layer and a more densely informational smart object layer? Cool. Okay. Smart objects don't necessarily have to be Illustrator files. It can be raster images as well. So it can be other pictures. So I'm going to drag and drop in my little reference photo with the material texture that I had. I forgot to download it. I'll just download this little image here from my travels. And once that is downloaded, I'm again just going to drag and drop it straight into Photoshop. I tend not to go through the file import process with Photoshop. It's something you can do. You can come up to the top and click File and then Import. I'm a drag and drop person, so that's how I go about it. So I'll drag and drop my little image into our file here. Check yes to accept. It's sitting below my line work right now, my shitty line work. So I'm just going to drag it on top so we don't have to look at that. It's brought this one in as a smart object as well. So this is a raster image, but it is paying attention to the pixels that exist. So it's going to allow me to resize this, make it super small, and then bring it back up to full capacity without losing any information. So I'm interested in this specific texture. So I want to kind of steal the outline of this marble texture so that we can put it into our image. But I want to work on that separately kind of from this Photoshop file. It's kind of an annoying process. One way I could go about this is grabbing the little polygonal lasso tool. So just the third tool from the top here. And I could select out a little area that I'm interested in. I'll just draw a little square to get this kind of material texture. Once I've got that selected, I can right click on that specific layer, hit duplicate layer. Oh, no, sorry, that's the wrong one. I only ever remember shortcuts, so I don't actually remember how you get to this in like formal file like file, edit, copy. But the shortcut I use is Control or Command J. So that'll duplicate only what you have selected. It'll make a new layer from your selection. So that was Control or Command J. You can see what it's done there. It's made a new layer. It's called it layer 1. And if I turn off everything else underneath by clicking on these little eyeballs here, that new layer is exactly what I had selected previously. So that's one way to go about it. Another way, kind of working with the smart object, the nature of a smart object, is we can actually come in and double click on this little icon here. So I'll double click on my smart object, and you can see instead of opening it up in Illustrator, since we're working with a photograph, it's just opened up a new kind of like little Photoshop file for this bad boy. So it's opened up our original source file, so we can edit it there. So I can kind of do the same process as I did before. I can select my little outline here. But this time, instead of kind of copying and making a new layer, because when we do that, we kind of lose all of the information of the stuff around it. Like maybe I did a shitty job selecting like I did here, and maybe I missed some pixels over here, but I didn't realize it until it was too late. This is what's called a destructive workflow. So when you're kind of deleting everything around what you're interested in, that is destructive. You're losing all of those pixels. And there's a time and a place for that when you want your file to be super small. But ideally, we really want to encourage you to use non-destructive workflows. So kind of trying to retain those pixels wherever you can, just in case you need to make changes and go back in and edit, because everybody makes mistakes. Everybody has bad days, as the icon says. So I'm going to go back in, reselect my little outline here, and instead we're going to use a slightly different strategy. So I'll select my little material that I want. And this time, instead of making a copy or even like erasing everything outside of this, which is another thing people do, using the little eraser tool, that is something you can do. Instead, I'm going to use a mask. So if you come down to the bottom right-hand corner of Photoshop, you should see a little icon here that's like a rectangle with a circle in the center. And if you hover over it, you'll get this little cute picture of a dog. And it'll say layer masks. Masks are Photoshop. This is the backbone of Photoshop. This is how you kind of erase and crop out things that you're interested in. This is a non-destructive workflow. So instead of deleting the pixels around it, you're basically just kind of like cropping them out for now. We're going to kind of paint them out using this layer mask here. So I'll show you what this looks like. If I click this little layer mask button while I have my layer selected, so you have to be clicking on the layer that you want to kind of crop. I'll click layer mask. You can see it has masked out everything outside of what I had selected. So all of those pixels are hidden from me now. It's made another little rectangle beside my initial kind of preview window here. And inside that rectangle, you can see it's mostly black. It's hard to see through the icon, but there's a little like white box essentially showing me where I had objects selected. So the way that a mask works in Photoshop, if I double click on it here, you can kind of see what's going on. I'll change it to a black and white view. So this is what my mask is doing. All of the areas that you paint white on a mask are going to be what's kind of kept in the picture. Those are the places that you want to keep. Everything that is painted over top with like black, that's what's going to be cropped out. So I know it's kind of confusing, but I'll show you what happens when we use, I'll get out of this little view for a second. So I'm back in Photoshop. This is my normal Photoshop window. I'm going to grab the little paintbrush tool over here. So I'm going to grab paintbrush. I'm going to make sure that the two colors that I have going on down here right now, I'm going to make sure that I'm using black. And the way, a shortcut to make sure that the color you're using is black is D. If you press D on your computer, it will give you a black and a white color palette here. And if you want to toggle between using black and using white, you can press X. So D will give you black. X will give you the ability to toggle between black and white. Whichever one is kind of in that left foremost, or the one on top, the little square on top, that's the one that you're using. So I've got my paintbrush selected. I'm going to come up to the top and make it really big because by default that paintbrush is super small. There's a whole bunch of different Photoshop brush presets you can use. We're not going to talk about it. It's too much. You can see when I paint on my layer normally, there's kind of nothing going on until I paint on the area that's still visible. And then you can see that it's there. So that's just painting on my normal layer. If, however, I switch over to this little mask icon here, so I click on the little black rectangle right beside that thumbnail, then we're dealing with the mask layer. We're not touching the image anymore. We're touching what's shown and what's hidden. So my brush right now is set to white. So the little color that I'm painting with is white right now. When I paint in white, you can see it brings back pieces of the image. So by painting with the white brush, we're bringing back the image. On the other hand, if I press X and switch to black, so now I'm painting with black, now we're cutting stuff out. So this is a really good way to go in and refine what you have selected. You can go in with the paintbrush and kind of paint in or out certain elements of your scene. Does that make sense? Is everybody okay? Cool. So these two kind of layers are linked together. By default, you kind of have, so you have your image underneath, and then you have the shapes that you've kind of painted on top to crop out what you're interested in. So again, if I look at what my mask layer is doing, I've got everything painted black except for this little rectangle that I'm interested in. So white is the stuff that we want to keep. If you want to kind of disconnect the relationship of kind of like the shape that you want to keep from the image underneath, you click this little chain icon here. So there's like a little chain link icon in between the picture on the left-hand side, the little thumbnail, and then the diagram of what you've cropped out. So again, by default, this little chain should be turned on. So if I click and drag things around, it's keeping the mask layer and the image layer locked one-to-one. So those two things are paired, they will move together. However, if you break that link, so you click on the little chain so it disappears, then those two things are separate. So your mask layer is separate from your image underneath. So if I click on my little image thumbnail here, you can see I can drag around the image in behind to get whatever piece of the image I want, without losing that kind of shape that I've traced out from the mask. And vice versa, if I move the mask around, so I'm clicking on this little mask icon, I can click and drag that little rectangle around until it's where I want it to be. Okay, so far so good. So that's what the little chain does. If it disappears, you just have to click in between here. So this looks good to me. This looks like the rectangle of material that I want to use. And so I am happy with this. I'm going to hit save. So Control S. It's gonna freak out on me. So I'm gonna save it as something else. I'll save this as a Photoshop file. Anytime you make changes to a JPEG that are kind of result in layers being added to the image, it's going to have trouble saving it back down to a JPEG. It's going to want to save it as a Photoshop file. So that's what's going on here. So I'll just save it as a Photoshop file. It's fine. And hopefully what we've got here, oh, maybe it didn't do it. Okay, bummer. So since it made me save it as a Photoshop file, it kind of broke that smart object relationship, unfortunately. It's no longer dealing with the original JPEG that it thought it was. And instead, we're dealing with the Photoshop layer. So I'm just going to delete this little JPEG, and I'm going to drag and drop that Photoshop file that I just saved to my desktop, hopefully. So I've got my little square of material I've dragged and dropped in there. So this is a smart object still. It's brought it in as one layer, but if I double click on that smart object thumbnail, it'll bring you back to the original kind of Photoshop file that we were working with. So if I add in a bunch of layers here and hit save and then get out of here, you can see it's flattening it back down to that one smart object, but we can double click to open that file back up and get all of those layers back. So this is just a way of working that helps keeps things super clean and minimal. It's super helpful also if you have a bunch of copies of something. So if I have a bunch of copies of this layer, you can make copies of a layer very quickly by pressing Command or Control J. It'll duplicate your layer for you, Command or Control J. So I've got a whole bunch of these smart objects. Since they're copies of each other, they're all referencing that same original file. If I go back in and make a change to that file, so let's say I paint a little heart on here or something, and then hit save, it'll update all of those smart object copies for me, which is great. So it's all interlinked, it's all connected. I'll just undo that because that's stressful. So one last thing I'll show you before we run out of time today. I just want to make sure that you're aware of the free transform control tools. So we've got this little layer here and it looks good, but it's the wrong perspective. It's not aligned with this kind of back face of materials that I'm interested in working with. And the easiest way to change that, the fastest and easiest way to change that is just to grab the corners of this little piece here and click and drag them out. But by default, it's going to kind of lock it again. Since we're dealing with a smart object, it's remembering how big that original file is, and it's kind of hard to get to the corners and click and drag it to the right size. So I'm actually going to rasterize this image so that it kind of forgets all of that information. So I'm just going to make it really big so that we don't lose too much information. And then I'll right click on that smart object and set it to rasterize layer. So rasterize layer gets rid of that little smart object icon. It ditches all of its knowledge and we're left with just a regular stupid layer. But now when I click and drag the corners, it's not trying to remember all of that other extra information. So it's easier to grab the corners. However, it's scaling everything proportionately, which is kind of annoying. I want to be able to grab one corner and kind of click and drag it out to change the perspective that this photograph is at. The shortcut for how to do that is pressing Control or Command on your keyboard. You can see when you do that, your mouse will change from this kind of like little drag it out icon to a little white arrow. And when you do that, you can just grab a corner at a time. So again, Control or Command, click the little corner, and then you can just drag out each corner to whatever kind of angle or perspective you need it to be. Once you're happy with what you've done, you have to kind of accept the changes that you've made. So I'm going to get this to line up in a way that looks like kind of okay with the background here. Again, just hitting Control or Command and clicking on the little corners. I'll check yes to accept. And now I've got a material that's kind of like better aligned with the face I want to apply it to. If you don't see these little corner points here, if your layer looks just like this and there's nothing to click on, You have to come up to the top here and make sure that show transform controls is checked. By default, this might not be turned on. So by default, you might not be able to grab a damn thing. But if you turn on show can transform controls, then those little kind of corner nodes will be there for you to grab. So command or control, click and drag. So these are probably, this is like, it may not seem like it, but this is the foundation of Photoshop. This is all you need to know to be a wizard. From here, all we need to do is kind of come back and select where we want this material to be applied. So I'm interested in having this kind of marble material along the back walls here. I'm going to turn off my shitty line work. So we still have only like my kind of good, my good line work is what's left. I'll select on my good line work layer. Always pay attention to what layer you're working on. I'll come back and grab the magic wand tool because it's the bluntest tool I have. I'll select out the little panels from my line work here just by holding down shift with the magic wand tool. I'll select all the panels that I want that marble texture to be applied to. I'll come back up to my marble texture layer and I'll click the little mask icon. So I'll click my little dog with his tongue out. And now we've got a mask applied. So my texture has disappeared. It was floating over here somewhere. I want to bring it back to where it's visible within what I had selected. So I just want to make sure that I unlink the mask from the image beneath. So I'll break this little chain. And then when I click on my little image thumbnail, I should be able to, oops, sorry. I will lock everything that is below it so I don't click on the wrong thing. I should be able to click and drag this image like back into the scene. So now I've got a marble texture applied to that selection, applied to that wall that I can click and drag around and scale. And you can keep using those transform control tools. They are good to go. The only other thing I really wanted to show you in terms of masking before we leave today, we've got 2 minutes left. It's really just for selecting things that are more complex than a regular old rectangle. So if I come back and I bring back in that original image from my travels, you can see that there's a tree in the background. And I know we love trees and we want to select trees a lot. So if I wanted to crop out this tree, for example, I might use something like the quick selection tool to grab what Photoshop thinks is the tree. Oops. But a lot of the time that's not a super great selection. And if I mask it, you can see what we're left with looks kind of shitty. So a really important thing to keep in mind is if you double click on your little mask layer, so double click on the little black square here, it'll open up that mask in kind of a separate UI so that you can really start to refine exactly what you have selected. I didn't know this until this year, you guys. This would have saved me lifetimes of effort. Double click on the mask layer. But there's a ton of different options for controlling what kind of selection you have. So you can smooth out that selection, you can feather it out, you can sharpen it with contrast, you can shift the edge. Like, holy shit, this would have saved my life a couple of years ago. But definitely play around with like the radius and fine tune what you have selected in this little interface. Okay, so that's my preach for the day. Double click on the little mask. I'll be in the courtyard if you have questions. Have a good day. Thank you.